Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to this semester's Backus Cienciała Memorial Lecture. My name is Vitaly Chernetsky. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and a faculty member in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. And our center takes pride in this lecture series as one of our signature marquee events. And it is wonderful to have this opportunity to bring distinguished historians of Poland to KU to share their research. Without further ado, I'm going to yield the floor to another dear colleague, Nathan Wood, who's an associate professor in the history department here, and who himself is a specialist in Polish history, and he will tell us a bit more about both the lecture series and about our distinguished guest speaker today.
Thank you. I'll stand here so that we can get this recorded as well. Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Backus Cienciała Memorial Lecture this evening. First, I'd like to say a few words about the people for whom this lecture is named. It's dedicated to the memory of two brilliant KU faculty, Oswald P. Backus III, who died in 1972, and Anna Cienciała, who died in 2015. Professor Backus was one of the early driving forces behind the development of KU as a nationally known center for the study of Russia and Eastern Europe. And so in the 1960s, his efforts really helped to to create the Slavic and Soviet Area Studies program, which is now known as the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, or CREASE, the institute that has invited our speaker here tonight. He taught history, law, and Slavic and Soviet Area Studies during his 22 years at the University of Kansas. And is credited for having helped to make KU's Slavic library collection one of the best in the country. Part of his personal library now resides at CREASE. Professor Cienciała, who joined Ozzy Backus here in 1965 and taught at KU until her retirement in 2002, was a world-renowned scholar of Polish history, Eastern and Central European history, and particularly the diplomatic history of interwar Poland, the Second Republic. She's best known for her definitive study with Wojciech Materecki and Natalia Lebedeva, Katyn, A Crime Without Punishment. In 2007, she received the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences in America. And on January 22nd, 2015, Deputy Chief of Mission of the Republic of Poland, Maciej Pisarski, and Deputy Consul Robert Ruszewski of the Chicago Consulate posthumously honored Cienciała with the Commander's Cross of Merit with Star, the state's penultimate honor for her contribution to knowledge about Poland. The ceremony, which was planned prior to her death, became a moving memorial service for this wonderful scholar, teacher, mentor, and promoter of Polish history. Professor Cienciała founded the Backus Lecture Series shortly after her retirement, and it has been my great pleasure, in consultation with my colleagues in Polish Studies here at KU, to invite so many excellent scholars to come and address the university community. It's always also a pleasure to see members of the Backus family, and I happily note the attendance of Roma Boniecka, Anna's dear friend and companion, who's here with us this evening. Our speaker, Dr. Anna Müller, is assistant professor of history and the Frank and Mary Pajeski Endowed Professor in Polish, Polish-American, and Eastern European Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Anya and I first met in graduate school at Indiana University, which incidentally is also Professor Cienciała and Eve Levin's alma mater. Although Anya and I did not, and of course Justina worked there as well. Although Anya and I did not overlap in coursework, I was disappointed about that, and we mainly got to know each other as young parents and dealing with, we were neighbors as well. It was very nice. Her home was not too far from ours. I have long admired Anya's work and stance as a historian. She, for me, emblemizes the historian as humanist. She masterfully handles some of the 20th century's most difficult and tragic topics with a keen and sensitive eye, unflinchingly and above all, humanely. A proud citizen of her hometown of Gdańsk, Anya has recently grieved the gruesome assassination of its beloved mayor Paweł Adamowicz. In 2012, she published a sensitive biography on one of the city's most important 20th century denizens, Anna Walentynowicz, who was a major founder of Solidarity and who perished in the tragic plane crash at Smolensk in 2010. She has also worked since 2010 as a curator for the Museum of the Second World War, where she is responsible for materials related to concentration camps, the Holocaust, and eugenics. Since 2015, with the Law and Justice or Peace Party, PIS, its acronym, in power, the museum's original vision has come under serious challenge as the nationalist government has sought to make the museum much narrower in its focus while asserting Polish heroism and victimhood. I'm extremely excited to learn more from Anya tomorrow in her presentation, her brown bag presentation in Bailey Hall 318, and I urge you to attend if you are able. The topic of Anya's talk tonight is her highly acclaimed book on the life of women in prison cells in post-war Poland, If the Walls Could Speak, Inside a Women's Prison in Communist Poland, published in 2017 with Oxford University Press. The book shows traces of two of Anya's major advisors, Marcy Shore and Patrick Kenny, both of whom have spoken here as Backus lecturers. Like Shore's book, Caviar and Ashes, this book is a collective biography of sorts. The cast of characters, Dramatis Personae, at the beginning of the book, which spans some 17 pages and includes 70 biographies. It is, I think, just alone overwhelming. It's astonishing the care with which Anya has approached each of these individuals' lives. Her respect for the complexity of each woman's life experience, her mastery of the numerous secret and paramilitary organizations to which they belong. This is another one of those books for which acronyms, you have to sort of keep track. There's so many of these organizations. And her careful reading against the grain of their interrogations, including attention to nuanced means of exhibiting agency in such physically and mentally trying circumstances. Her own effort in interviewing surviving women in the last years of their lives and to understand their experiences and the narratives that they created is really masterful. Like Kenny, Anya's interest in political prisoners tells us much about the collective and individual experience of the totalizing modern state. Anya's choice in this book to focus on women gives agency and depth to individuals whose stories have heretofore so often been told in relationship to men. Please join me in welcoming Anya Müller to the lecture.
Thank you for inviting me. Nathan, thank you for this beautiful introduction. I feel like anything I'm going to say right now about this book is going to ruin the beautiful introduction that you just gave. Okay, I'm going to turn on my clock, just not to talk for too long. Before I start, I would like to say that I see a little fog in front of me. I had a very long night. My plane was delayed, and I'm not saying this to feel sorry for myself, but just please excuse me if there are moments when you have no idea what I'm talking about. I'll try to be brief and clear, but please just be patiently with me. So this book that I was invited, am I loud enough or should I speak louder? Okay. Okay, I can be very loud if I have to.
Nicer to be louder.
Louder. Okay, I'll try to be louder. So this book that I am I was very happy to be invited to speak about is essentially what I treat as an ethnography of a life in a prison cell. In this book, at the beginning of this book, I tried to contextualize the circumstances in which the new communist regime that was being established in Poland soon after the war was trying to introduce a new penitentiary system for mostly people, women and men, who were involved in different groups of the war resistance and post-war resistance against the Nazis, against the communists. The majority of the women that I'm talking about, the majority of the women that I'm talking about consider themselves to be political prisoners, but they were never considered as such by the regime that imprisoned them. The regime saw them always as anti-state, a category that they actually rejected. So the book starts with sort of the sketch of the emergence of the penitentiary system as something that was emerging in this post-war, in the atmosphere of post-war chaos and shortages of almost everything. And when I say everything, that includes uniforms for the prisoners, for the prison administration, but also, things that seem to be essential for the functioning of prisons, such as prison gates, keys to prison gates, etc. The penitentiary system that was emerging in those years, 1944-45, was based on two very important units. The MBP, the Ministry of Public Security, Ministerstwo Bezpieczeństwa Publicznego, and the Prison and Camps Department. And that meant that on the one hand, the people that were going through the prison system were facing very brutal state vigilance and arbitrary violence. And on the other hand, they were dealing with rather incompetent attempts of state rehabilitation that was carried out by very uneducated staff. The majority of this book is based on oral interviews with either the former female prisoners or their family members. So what I was trying to do, and again, I should repeat that I almost throughout the entire book, I'm staying in prison cell with this woman. What I was trying to do, I was trying to show how these women were trying to recreate some sort of life in a prison cell. And it started with how they were negotiating their position during interrogations, and then how they tried to recreate some kind of normalcy, how they tried to transform the prison, the cell space, to regroup and gather some strength, how they actually use their bodies to liberate themselves from the physical limitation of a prison cell, but also how they use their bodies in order to exercise some kind of pressure on the prison authorities, and how they explored the space of a prison cell in order to create relationships for themselves, new relationships, family relationships. They were creating relationships that could resemble relationships between mothers and daughters, even intimate romantic relationships. Towards the end of the book, I look at the daily prison life in those post-interrogation prisons. Throughout the majority of the book, you see the women in interrogation cells, in the cells where their daily life is being disrupted, interrupted by constant interrogation. At the end of the book, I try to look at those post-interrogation cells where the women were to spend, the majority of their sentence, and at the daily life that was happening then. And what I am observing is that women actually dealt with this mixture of boredom as a phenomenon that actually stood at a very sharp contrast to everything that I experienced throughout the war and soon after the war. And I'm looking at how they try to distract themselves from this overwhelming idleness, sense of passivity, of uselessness of this time that they are spending in prison. So essentially, this life in prison appeared to me as a mixture of boredom and desperation, with those occasional, intensely intoxicating moments of clarity that kept showing me, and I think it was showing to them too, that emptiness is never bare, and there is always something, even in a very empty prison cell. The small space of a prison cell, the most extreme of settings, essentially something that is, an antithesis of freedom, I believe is at the center of the Polish experience of Stalinism, something that I will try to return to a little later in this talk. So let me tell you a little bit about the women that I'm talking about. Some of them were jailed, were imprisoned for their alleged collaboration with the Nazis during the war. That's how their activism was sometimes being interpreted, that whatever they were doing was working in favor of the Nazis. The majority of these women were, however, arrested and sentenced for their post-war activism, for their participation in various civil and military organizations that were emerging in Poland soon after the end of the war. There were also a number of them who were arrested for their relationships with their sons, their husbands, their partners, their brothers, members of, again, various anti-communist organizations. In some cases, there was some evidence of their anti-communist activity. In many other cases, the evidence was basically very cumbersome and simply absurd. Let me give you a couple of examples. And here, I will see whether I even know how that works. Okay, it works. Elżbieta Zawadzka. In an interview with me and with whoever else was interviewing her, she liked to start an interview. She liked to emphasize that she didn't speak Polish until she was 10 years old. Her first native language was German. She was known as Zo, and she was the second and so far the last woman who received to hold the rank of Brigadier General of the Polish Army. During the war, she was an instructor of the military training for women, przygotowanie wojskowe kobiet. And during the war, she started serving as a courier going east for the home army. She was carrying letters and other documents from the Nazi-occupied Poland to the Polish government in exile in Backus. She was responsible for a very important mission of bringing money for the Polish underground during the war from London. The Home Army primarily existed from funds from the Polish government in London, and from London the money was being sent to Sweden, and from Swedish banks the money was being transferred to Berlin, where the Polish Home Army had somebody that was working with them, and he was meeting with Elżbieta Zawadzka to give her the money for the Polish underground in Poland. And then she would travel with this money in the double bottom suitcase with fake IDs, fake documents to Poland. This is a map. This is not a map that shows you how she traveled. This is a map that shows you how Jan Karski traveled. I'm sure in this crowd I don't need to tell you who Jan Karski was. But her mission was very similar. She traveled in a very similar way, meaning that from Warsaw, she would go to Berlin. That's where she would usually pick the money for the Polish underground. If she was going to London, she would usually go through France, Spain, and back to London. Towards the end of the war, she was part of the Cichociemne, the silent and unseen paratroopers. That means that she was the only woman that was being parachuted to Poland, dropped in Poland, and actually she stayed. And soon after the war, she was engaged in sort of helping to recreate some of the espionage cells. And she was arrested during one of the actions. And in 1951, she was sentenced to 10 years for treason and espionage. Another example is Wiesława Pajdak-Śmiechowska. She was the daughter of Antoni Pajdak, one of the leaders of the Polish underground, who was one of the 16 leaders who were arrested in 1945 and then abducted to Moscow, where they underwent a trial, and then he was sent to Siberia. During the war, she worked for her father. She mostly delivered the messages, the secret messages that were transferred from the Auschwitz resistance cells outside of Auschwitz, with the information, how many people is there, what kind of people the new transports brought, what kind of medicine they need. So she would usually deliver those messages to her father in order to be delivered further to bring some help. What is she arrested for? For the first time, she was arrested in 1947. She's arrested twice. For the first time, she's arrested in 1947 because she's trying to figure out where her father is and what her father is really arrested for. She's released soon after. Her mother is imprisoned with her. On her way out of prison, she finds out that her mother killed herself in prison. Her mother committed suicide in prison. She's arrested again in 1951, and this time she received a sentence of 6 years. And here you see two different photos from two different periods of arrest. Another example, and this one is particularly important for me because you see a very unique set of photographs. There were two women, Krystyna Włodarz-Jakimek and her sister, Maria Walkowiak, who after the war renewed contact with their pre-war friends who escaped Poland soon after the war via Munich to London. And these friends started sending them food packages. That food packages actually included some coded information, trying to convince these two girls, these two very young women, to start some kind of espionage activity. They did not quite understand what they were supposed to do with these messages, but they were at some point caught with those food packages and with the coded letters, and then sentenced to 12 years. What's interesting about these photos is that for some reason the Ministry of Public Security decided to take photos of these women with the content of the food packages that they were receiving from abroad. And here's Maria Walkowiak. And finally, Halina Lebiedowicz, who was one of the Ukrainians that were kept in the Polish prisons. She was imprisoned for her activity for the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and for her activities against the Operation Vistula, the forced resettlement of the Ukrainian population that was living in Poland. And essentially she's, this is a very typical Ukrainian story. Somebody who is arrested for the UPA involvement, actions against the Operation Vistula, and somebody who is very vulnerable because she doesn't have family in Poland. So soon after being released from Polish prison, she's actually being contacted by the secret police that is monitoring her life, her movement, the place where she lives, in order to see whether she is interested in spying against the Ukrainian community, for example, for the passport that will allow her to leave Poland and travel to reunite with her family. So the majority of women that were imprisoned in those prisons are actually anti-communist. They are imprisoned for activities in those various alternations of the Home Army or the National Armed Forces, Ukraine Insurgent Army. But in addition to the women that had some kind of anti-communist stance, there are a number of women that were communists. Around 1948-49, some supporters of communism also started entering the penitentiary system, and I will tell you a little bit more about them later. Trial proceedings and sentences were very arbitrary. The women received sentences usually between usually of 3 to 5 years, in many, many cases between 10 and 15 years. Social standing. So the majority of the sources that I had a chance to look at are very skewed. The majority of the women who wrote about their prison experience, the majority of the women that left some kind of memoirs or diaries or agreed to be interviewed by me, represented higher or middle social strata. Primary Polish city dwellers, intelligentsia, pre-war landowners. So as a result, the available sources, the sources that were available to me at least, do not represent a cross-section of the society. Women from social lower classes are certainly underrepresented in my work. They only existed as people that are being talked about, but not people that I actually had a chance to talk to. There's an interesting caveat that is probably not very surprising for the majority of you. While men in their recollections occasionally or very often complain about the low social intellectual level of many of their cellmates that actually affected life in a prison cell, the women, on the other hand, usually underline the exceptional composition of the cells. And this is something that is common in almost every single recollection, interview, memoir, even a diary that I had a chance to receive. So they were almost on purpose minimizing the potential conflict and emphasizing cell diversity, and concentrating on the stories of collaboration and the possibility of actually achieving consensus instead of conflict. But this can be obviously linked. One thing is it's definitely linked to the way women were being socialized, but it can be also linked to the fact that only 10% of the entire prison population were women. So there were less women, female cells, and the population socially, if you look at the social profile, that population is certainly very, very different. Okay, let me just take a sip of water. So what am I trying to achieve? What was I trying to do with this book? The problem with writing about prison, spending so much time in a prison cell, is that it's very easy to universalize this experience. Prison cells are the same almost everywhere else. And I actually I'm part of the Inside Out Prison Exchange program, so I teach in prison. For the program, we actually take 15 outside students inside a prison facility. We teach in a maximum security prison, and we have 15 inside prison. And the stories that I received there are very similar to the stories that I was receiving from my interviewees for the book. What I am learning from my students right now, and what I was learning before from the people that I had a chance to interview, is that prisons not only crash, but also create identities. They actually create people. And in my book, I see women, the women that I'm writing about, I saw them using their senses to orient themselves in prison space. They use their bodies to gain control over themselves, and also as means to exercise pressure on the prison authorities through fasting, prison hunger strikes, even attempts or successful suicides. So over and over again, and as you can imagine, Foucault was sort of big part of my graduate school. So over and over again, I was sort of learning about, the docile body, how gaze, control can subjugate. But from this woman is actually learning that when you reverse that gaze, when you struggle with that gaze, that moment is at the same time very liberating and helps an individual to regain a sense of agency. Nature and culture. So again, this goes back to the fact that this is a graduate. This is based on my PhD dissertation, right? That's how it was called. Yes, PhD dissertation. So when I was in graduate school, we talked a lot about how gender is performed, how this is something that we invent, right? And I saw examples of this performance throughout, the entire stage of gathering sources and then writing it out. But there were also elements of nature that cannot be reduced. Exhaustion, hunger, menstruation in prison cells, breastfeeding mothers, labor in prison cells. So there were multiple stories that were showing me how, on the one hand, human biology cannot be reduced, but on the other, there were stories that were showing me this incredible human capacity for recreation. So there was this constant tension between body, again, as a performative site for gender, on the one hand, and as a site of physical weakness, on the other hand. Okay, but going beyond something that is very universal. As you can imagine, I always get a question of what's unique in this story about Polish women. Polish historiography usually talks a lot about Polish martyrology, right? Seeing the people that go through the experience of prisons as Polish heroes, as people that suffered for Polish nation. What's interesting is that the woman I had a chance to talk to, the woman that I had a chance to interview, did not underline the narrative of heroism and martyrdom, but rather the narrative of individual efforts and creativity. And here are a couple of quotes from some of my interviews, all three from different prisoners. In prison, we tried to create a deeper meaning or to survive it in a way that gave us a chance to leave prison and enter freedom as normal or even enriched people. This was not wasted time. It was time that made us richer. We lost a lot, but nobody will take away from us those contacts, experiences, friends. Another former prisoner. This was not completely wasted time. Another one. Nobody should think of us as martyrs. And this story I heard over and over again. They use the term postawa. And right now I'm in the process of trying to figure out who used it for the first time. They were constantly using this term postawa. And in postawa, it means, it's either postawa or trzymać fason, which actually refers to a style of standing, behaving, as if somebody was watching you all the time. You have to act as if somebody was watching you all the time. And I honestly think that this movie pushed them to start thinking about themselves and their behavior in prison in terms of postawa. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this movie, but I imagine that most. It's a movie from 1982 titled Interrogation, and it's about interrogation, a woman being interrogated. So this is really sort of the only popular culture artifact that speaks to their story. So they comment on this movie. They were commenting on this movie all the time in interviews with me. So in the movie, you see a woman, Tonia, and here is Tonia, who is a rather accidental prisoner. She gets drunk in a bar, and she gets imprisoned. She doesn't understand why she is imprisoned. She's very desperate. She screams and cries. She's having intimate relationships with another woman. And then, in the end, she's having a close relationship with her interrogation officer, and she has a baby with him. So many women that I talk to refuse to accept that this story is actually representing their stories. They would say that they never screamed and cried, that they always sort of maintained postawa, which means that they always acted as if somebody is watching. So they would never let themselves be dirty, for example, in prison. And they would never have any kind of relationships with interrogation officer. Regardless whether it's true or not, because you can imagine that it's not, I think that this concept of postawa, for them it actually meant, I think I can go back, for them it actually meant a sense of control over their emotions, their body, and their physical space, right? It was sort of a way to externalize their strength and integrity. But I think the concept of postawa essentially helps them to go beyond this very typical Polish concept of being a martyr. This was sort of their own way, very individual way that they came up with, years, decades after their release, of actually dealing with their imprisonment and their prison reality. This is sort of one of my next projects, is sort of to see this concept as postawa as a form of transgression for them. Something very dynamic that they acquire during the process of socialization, but sort of a phenomenon that helped them cross many boundaries and helped them to adapt to different circumstances. And paradoxically, actually helped them define their space outside of this very narrowly defined concept of martyrdom, heroism, giving them a sense of individual enrichment, but ultimately also giving them a voice as Polish patriots. And finally, sort of my last interventions, something that it doesn't come very clearly in the book, because I don't think I was brave enough to say it. But I think it's there. Sort of, what does it tell us about, the Polish Stalinism? It's very difficult to generalize. First of all, this book is really only based on female voices. I am definitely missing, a big part of the society. And the key sort of elements of the Polish Stalinist experience is there: the suffering, the pain, degradation. When I was working on this book, as I already mentioned, there were sort of two big historiographical discussions going on. The first one was about, that I already mentioned, Polish martyrology. What does it mean to be a Polish hero in Stalinist prisons? And another one, Nathan already mentioned, my supervisor, Padre Kenny, was sort of writing this global history of imprisonment, where he said that shared experience of prison, where he talked about shared experiences of prison, saying that imprisonment is a form of a tool, right? It's a form of political activity. If you imprison people, they will eventually turn into political activists. They will use imprisonment as a form of political tool. The woman that I wrote about certainly did not see, as I was trying to show, imprisonment as a form of suffering, but neither did they see it as a form of political activism. But they didn't collaborate with the communist regime either, right? But essentially they found, and here is sort of the biggest question that I'm still struggling with, teaching in prison, thinking about prison, reading about prisons. Do prisons work? What do they do to us? The women were neither aggressive opponents, neither they cooperate, and yet the prison, the sort of forced passivity, this moment when they were detached completely from their world, their families, push them to start thinking about their post-prison lives in terms of service, things that they can do. They were looking forward to working for the communist Poland, even though they didn't recognize the communist Poland as their Poland, because there were a number of rehabilitation practices that the prison authorities were engaging them in, movies, discussions about the rebuilding of Warsaw, etc., etc. They were looking forward to going out there and participating in this new communist world, even though many of them didn't consider themselves communist. They somehow managed to see a difference between society, communist state, and Poland was somewhere in between for them. And again, doesn't mean that prisons work. I don't know. I'm still unsure on that question. but it certainly pushed women to transform themselves, to open themselves to this post-prison communist Polish reality. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about the sources and the stories in this book. Of course, oral interviews, but also interrogation protocols. The interrogation protocols are extremely long. Some of them had hundreds and even, 1,200, 1,300 pages. They are mostly handwritten, and some people claim that they may be invented, so we should not be treating them as, good historical sources. I think that they do record, they give us a sense of some kind of conversation, exchanges that were happening in interrogation cells between interrogators and prisoners. Some historians claim that there were financial incentives that were given for the amount of pages. The more pages you deliver to the people that were taking notes from those interrogations, the more you are being paid. I don't believe, knowing what I know about who were taking those notes, I don't believe that they were able to invent it, right? So they were actually trying to record as much as it was possible what was going on in those interrogation rooms. The Polish interrogation officers were following Soviet biographical method, which meant that they were asking the prisoners the same questions over and over again, trying to find differences, some kind of inconsistencies in the stories that were being delivered. And the women, the interrogation protocols that I looked at, the women that I had a chance to interview, they did engage in those different conversations. They tried to lie, confess certain things, maneuver. They responded to how the situation developed. And I'll show you one example. Felicia Wolf, or Wolf. She was a soldier already during the First World War. When the Second World War broke out, she first got involved into the Union of Armed Struggles, Związek Walki Zbrojnej, that then turned into Home Army. She functioned as a courier on routes going east through Soviet Union. In January 1941, she's arrested, sent to Kazakhstan. Then she leaves Kazakhstan with the Polish corpse of General Władysław Anders. After the war, she returned to Poland and is continuing working as a courier. This time she is going usually west. So she is almost repeating the routes that Zawadzka was taking during the war. And here is Anna Neumann. Felicia Wolf. Okay. Yeah, that's her. I'm already confusing. I was very confused when I was reading Interrogation Protocols, and I'm confusing you. Okay, so an older person is being arrested in February 1949 for legally crossing the German-Czechoslovak border. And she's introducing herself as Anna Neumann. And here you have a name. At the same time, we know, and everything is sort of in the same interrogation folder, right? And the secret police is looking for Felicia Wolf. They don't know much about them, except that these two women potentially look alike. Anna Neumann presents herself as old. She presents herself older than she is at this time, as a domestic servant who is not very educated. She's very lonely. She lost her entire family during the Second World War, and she's trying to reunite with her sister who is in Germany. That's why she's crossing the Czechoslovak-German border to reunite with her sister. And the secret police lets her go. Right? They see the point, like they don't see the point. Why would they keep this older woman who is just lonely? They let her go. In 1951, the same woman is arrested again. At this point, the secret police starts assuming that Anna Neumann and Felicia Wolf are exactly the same people, right? She's still presenting herself as Anna Neumann. And you see hundreds of pages of the interrogation protocols when they keep asking the same question. Where is your family? Why did you want to go? What did you do during the war? And because, those interrogations go on and on, sometimes 24 hours and longer, Anna Neumann sort of slowly starts losing her control over what she's saying. So she is, for example, at some point testified that she had one son. A couple of months later, she's saying that she had two sons. At some point, you start seeing notes in the interrogation protocol indicating that the secret police knows that this is not Anna Neumann, that this is actually Felicia Wolf, or Auntie, because that's how she was being called in the anti-Nazi resistance. So it sort of resembles this game at some point where everybody plays, and everybody seems to know that Anna Neumann knows, or Felicia Wolf, she knows that they know that she's not who she's presenting herself, but they keep playing it for a couple of months. They even went to visit her hometown, Surplash, where they sort of get more evidence of who she really was. In December 52, and again there is a note in her interrogation protocols, the secret police knows that she's not Anna, but Auntie or Felicia Wolf. February 52, trial, she's sentenced to death. A couple of months later, her sentence is commuted to life, and she was very lucky, because if she was actually sentenced in 1949 and sentenced to death, she probably would have been executed. What's interesting about her is that she actually refused to sign her sentence, saying that she's not Felicia Wolf, but Anna Neumann, right? So even after the sentence is announced, she's still playing this game, saying this is not who I am. At some point, they also brought into interrogation room people that were collaborating with her during the war, asking them who this woman is. And one of them was Maria Opala, who said, in answer why she was going back and forth between the borders, she would say, not to battle for sweets, but to spy. So there are people that worked with her coming into the room saying, yes, you're right, this is who she is. And yet, you know, her response was, witnesses can testify to whatever they want, but it doesn't make it true. So my point of looking at those interrogations was not to find out who she really was, who was guilty, who testified what, but to see what kind of games, what kind of discussions, what kind of conversation exchanges were happening in those rooms, with the sort of assumption that all of this is very polished, devoid of any violence that was normally taking place in interrogation rooms. A little bit more about the sources. When I was interviewing people, I would always ask them for some personal memorabilia, sources, artifacts from prisons, things that they would embroider in prison cells, poems, and letters that they would write. This one is special because this one I actually found in a letter from 1944. It's a poem. These women were inventing a lot of poems. They were not allowed to write things down, so they had to keep it in their memory. Again, not unusual sort of thing to do in prison. They were keeping a lot of these poems that they were composing in their memory. In this particular case, one of the prisoners, one of the women, actually wrote it down in a letter to her family, and she sent it out, and it went through the prison censorship without any problems. This is referring to a prison wedding where she and the man from neighboring cell, they promised to reunite after they were released from prison. More poems by Irena Tomalak, actually also somebody who was very high up in the Polish army, a woman. What's interesting about the both poems are written in prison, and they sort of speak to exactly the thing that I was trying to describe earlier, the sense of contrast between the activism in the war, during the war, and then the sense of total idleness in prison cell. The first one says, I can walk, run, chase, knock on the door, bang on windows, I can be silent, whisper, talk, shoot, carry, eat paper, once on the pavement, once through a channel, my little legs run. She's talking about her role of being a courier during the war, sort of being active, having a purpose, having a sense of life. And the next one is from a prison cell written a couple of months later. I lost many dear ones and my past, almost entirely. My children survived. I found them and wanted to give back, father, create home anew, family, and I wasted their fate and my own, worse than from the German hand. And I am alive instead of dying. And she writes this in a prison cell. Here I will just mention one thing. The two women, Emilia Malesa and Barbara Sadowska, very important people for the Polish resistance, but in prison, they are actually trying to initiate, and that's after their trials, actually after Sadowska's trial, because Malesa is released and she commits suicide in front of the prison gates because she's, it's a long story, so I'll skip it for now, but I'll tell you a little bit about Sadowska. She tries to not collaborate, but she tries to enter some kind of conversation with the prison authorities, trying to convince them to change the conditions of imprisonment for these women, saying that these women are open to go and work for the communist Poland, but you cannot treat them the way you treat them. And here's an excerpt from the very long report that she wrote, where she said, the midwife of the new regime, and the midwife is essentially the new penitentiary system, does not have to be an obstetric hag. She calls it baba położnicza. I have no idea where it's a good translation. Who in a very primitive way welcomes a newborn to the world. If you want a baby to live, be healthy and strong. One of the most painful, and I'm almost done, another 5 minutes, one of the most painful sources from prison, cell spy reports. Okay, so let me tell you one more story and then I will end. At some point, because I am in a prison cell, I was with this woman in a prison cell for a very long time. I complained about it to everybody that was willing to listen to me, right? I was so done with being in a prison cell. And at some point, a good friend of mine said, you know, it's actually great. It's like a Greek tragedy, right? Unity of action, unity of space, unity of time. Prison cell is very claustrophobic space. So I started to think about it that way, being a sort of a Greek tragedy. So I tried to reconstruct the relationships that develop in at least one prison cell. And this was possible in only one prison cell, where I was actually able to tell who was in one prison cell, how long, what kind of conversations they were having. This is how the prison cell more or less looked like. 2 by 2 meters with one metal frame attached to a wall, but there were 4 or 5 women. They could not use this one metal frame, so they were just using pallets they were spreading on the floors, and that's how they would sleep. They spent over 5 months in cell 26 in Mokotów in Warsaw from September 1949 to early 1950. And here is sort of the group of women that were in this one prison cell. Sabina Stalińska, a Home Army member. During the war, she worked for the government delegation for the Polish government in exile, and she was a commandant on the underground police force. I think that's the key information about her, that she worked for the underground police force. Halina Zakrzewska was heading the 2nd Department of the Home Army, a unit responsible for espionage and counterintelligence. Sabina Stalińska, when she's in prison, by the way, she leaves behind a small son, Maciej. Halina Zakrzewska lost her first pregnancy during her first imprisonment. When she's in prison for the 2nd time, at this time she has a little baby at home. Tonia Lechtman, a Jewish communist, who actually left Poland in 1935 for Palestine. Then she traveled with her husband to Spain, where she was fighting. She didn't, but her husband was fighting the Spanish Civil War. She stayed in France. She had 2 children. She survived the war in Switzerland. She comes back with Noel Field, American who was spying for Soviet Union, and she's imprisoned as a communist in 1947. So you have 2 women from the Home Army, a communist, and Ewa Piwińska, another communist. She was operating an illegal printing press for the People's Guard, a communist underground military organization. Then she's in prison in Pawiak. She's in prison in Majdanek. And then after the war, from Majdanek, she was transferred to Ravensbrück. After the war, she is being sent to work as a diplomat in Italy. Actually, she's an assistant to some diplomat in Italy. She's on a train to Rome, and the train is being stopped. She's being taken off the train to Miedzeszyn to a special cell for communist prisoners with a 3-month-old baby. And then there is an Ukrainian, right? So you have 2 communists, 2 Home Army women, and Vera Shot, a woman that is imprisoned for Ukrainian insurgent army. One of them is writing interrogation protocols. One of them is writing cell spy reports. And one of these women is telling us exactly what's happening in the prison cell. And here are just some excerpts from those cell spy reports. According to Zakrzewska, all of these women, Piwinska, that's the communist who had it, this little baby, lost the most. She lost her daughter, and she also lost something that was a condition of her existence, a belief in an idea. She is a communist who is being imprisoned by communists. She's really struggling to sort of keep her faith in communism. About Piwinska, she's an enthusiast, sincerely and with all her heart devoted to communism. She lives and breathes. Ona oddycha komunizmem, that's how it was in Polish, this idea. She knows nothing about people's perfidy. Impulsive, she makes a good impression on her cellmates. Her empathy toward others and their problem wins over her adversaries. Lechtman, sincere in relationships, direct, modest, straightforward, full of life, idealist, sincere and devoted communist. Pages and pages of that, right? Sort of reporting of the conversations that are happening, but also showing us how open and dynamic this relationship was. This report certainly tell us something about life in a prison cells, role that cell spies actually played, and shows that there was nothing predetermined, regardless who these women were, communists, Ukrainians. There was nothing predetermined in their relationships. It also perhaps pushes us to believe that prison was working, because it was actually sort of producing a more cooperative attitude and self-critique, because some of these women were self-critiquing themselves among these women. And it sort of created this atmosphere without any conflict, internal conflict, right? And there was this cascade of confessions when these women were trying to figure out what happened in their lives. But there was no conflict. It was sort of moral cooperation, right? So maybe it wasn't working. And I think I will end here with sort of this larger question about agency and the role those sort of mobile regimes, how they immobilize individuals, and how individuals try to regain their agency. Thank you. One more, but I will finish.
All right. Our big thanks to Professor Müller, and we do have some time for your questions and comments. So, dear colleagues, dear guests, the floor is yours. Yes, please.
So I was a little confused as to why 3 of the women were communists and they were imprisoned in a communist prison. What specifically?
Yeah. It's a very confusing situation. I agree. There are very specific reasons for why these women were in prison. But there was this. I'm sorry. Oh, here. Oh, Mike. Sorry. There's a number of reasons. They were in prison in different cases, right? Some of them for alleged collaboration with Americans, maybe spying against Americans. It was an internal purge, essentially. They were trying to purge the Communist Party of the people, for example, that were communists since the 1930s, or they were working with the people because Stalin liquidated the Polish Communist Party in the 1930s, right? So some of the Polish communists stayed in the Soviet Union, and then they returned to Poland, and there is a big distrust towards Polish communists. So there are a number of reasons when this is happening. This is a small number, right? And what's interesting is that when I was actually interviewing my Home Army women, every time I would ask a question, were there any communists, they would say exactly what you said. Well, how is that possible? This was a communist prison. There were no communist prisoners, right? And then slowly, if I actually had a name, then the list started growing bigger and bigger and bigger, because there was a number of them, right? A number of very important Polish communist politicians were in prison at the time, and any woman that was associated somehow with these men was in prison as well. Earlier today, we actually had a great conversation about Anna Durac, who was, a secretary to one of the very important Polish communists, and she was in prison as well. So it's not quite clear why they were in prison. The causes were certainly invented, but there was a number of them. And that's what they are doing too to themselves, right? They are trying to figure out why they are even here. Because the anti-communists, the Home Army women, they know, but these women don't. And that's why it's so painful sometimes to read those self-spy reports, because they struggle with this question and everybody around them struggles with this question. And sooner or later, Tonia Lechtman, this one actually says, the line that we know from the Soviet cases, objectively, I am not guilty, I didn't do anything, but subjectively I'm guilty. I must have done something. Maybe I was working with the wrong people. Maybe Noel Field is guilty.
How did you find the women you wanted to interview?
That's actually how the entire project started. I was on, when I went to Indiana University for PhD, I wanted to do a project on women of solidarity. Because I was from Gdańsk, solidarity was a big part of who I was, how I grew up. This was my thing. And I was not allowed to do that project in Poland at that time, because gender was not a category that, could be easily. Much has changed in Poland since then. So I started interviewing. I went on my summer dissertation research, and I started interviewing the women of solidarity, and I just realized this is not my topic. I cannot. This was too fresh of a topic. We were not communicating at all. And then one of them arranged a meeting with her aunt, who was actually a former communist, and Janina Janiszowska, who during the first meeting, she looked at me and she said, "You cannot get it. You have no idea what we went through. You are never going to understand us." And she got me hooked somehow. And then she, facilitated connection with many other people. And I think this was partially a problem because she was so strongly entrenched in Warsaw, and it is the community of, rather urban women. It was very hard for me to sort of then connect with the women in the villages, for example, the partisans, the women that were in the insurgent units, right? I was able to interview some of them, but not many, because I was lacking a connection to these women.
Yes, Sana.
Thank you very much for this informative talk. And I have a question that refers to the idea of agency that you brought up in your talk. So when you interviewed these women, they constantly emphasized that they did not suffer, that they did not see themselves as martyrs, and instead they tried to maintain what you call postawa, right? So you can see this idea of postawa as their response to the gaze that was directed to them from this panopticon of the prison in Plutonian sense. But you can also see postawa or fason, right, as a form of resistance, because they were trying to cling to whatever made them human, right, to their femininity. And it actually reminds me of the argument that Oksana Kis, the Ukrainian historian, makes in her book Ukrainian Women in the Gulag to Survive. Survive means to win, where she says that in many times, in a lot of cases, Ukrainian women try to maintain their femininity, and even she sees it as a form of resistance, because they try kind of to keep their clothes clean, or just to wash themselves every day, or to do whatever, right, that kind of to preserve this femininity. So can you mention maybe more examples, talk about more examples of resistance in these prisons by these women?
That's exactly, well, I don't want to say it's the same thing. I think I'm trying, and only in the book, because earlier I was sort of also playing with this idea of resistance, because they didn't call it resistance. I think this is exactly what Oksana Kis is talking about. They were, for example, one of the idea was, okay, we go into trial, right? You have to look as good as you can in a trial, right? So they had their own ways of ironing clothes, having a makeup, washing their hair, right? But they didn't use the term resistance. So I think they were talking about a form of individual enrichment, and the term they used was postawa. I think it's a very fine line we're walking here, but they were trying to sort of distinguish what they were doing from the concept of Polish heroism, right? We're not heroes, we try to maintain our humanity, and the term they used was postawa. And I'm trying to, and I think this is what sort of makes their story somehow culturally unique. I'm trying to, that's why I said it's important for me to figure out who used the term postawa first, where is it coming from, just to see how much, I believe this has something to do with the legionistki, the first woman in the Polish legions, but I don't know yet. But I think this was their cultural specificity, that's what they did, that they really distinguished what they were doing from, you know, men who talked about their activities, their behavior in prison, often in terms of, you know, some sort of heroism, right? They didn't even talk about maintaining, you know, sort of, what's the word, human. They didn't talk about retaining humanity, but postawa was the term that they used. But I think we're talking about very similar practices that Oksana Kis is talking about. It's the question of how do we call those practices, right? And how we nuance the understanding of these practices.
Would dignity perhaps be a word that, I mean, I'm thinking of assertion of one's personal dignity. And
yes, I think so. Yeah, that's why I think it relates very closely to, you know, this idea of, you know, like, let's remain human in the humanizing conditions. But that's true in every single prison circumstances. I think it's, you know, very similar to how prisoners in contemporary America deal with their imprisonment. Not all of them, of course, but many of them, right? Dignity, sort of humanity is something that they do talk about. And I think that maybe the difference lies in the language that people are using. And how they sort of, I think, in this case, the Polish woman case, they really try to distinguish themselves from this concept of Polish heroism. They wanted to have their own story heard. I think, I don't know how many of you are following what's happening in Poland, but there is this, you know, incredible push for this whole concept of cursed soldiers, and many of these women were essentially cursed soldiers, right? So it will be very interesting to to interview them right now and see how they sort of find their own story in the story of the cursed soldiers. In most cases, it's impossible. As far as I know, all the women that I interviewed passed away.
yes.
I just wanted to ask about the accessibility of the documents that you experienced. I'm assuming you were able to access the documents, right?
Right. It's mostly IPN. It's mostly IPN. There's not much. I mean, there are some stories regarding the communist women. You know, like the Tonia Lechtman, Piwińska, Anna Duracz. That's Archiwum Akt Nowych. The majority was in IPN. When I started, I think my first visit to IPN was 2007, and I had to wait 7 months for the documents. And Felicia Wolf, this was actually the first file I received. And what's interesting, I hesitated for a second whether to tell that or not. What's interesting is that because the file is huge. The file has like, I don't know, 1,200 pages. And when they gave it to me in IPN, this is a place where in 2007 you were not allowed to make copies, right? How do you even read 1,200 pages in an archive when it's handwritten and it's not that clear to read? They gave it me on a CD, and they let me use my own laptop, is my answer. Right? This was possible in 2007. In 2008, it wasn't possible anymore, and right now, IPN, I actually don't know what happens, what the situation is right now, but in year ago, 2 years ago, if you actually requested those files in the local IPN archives, not in Warsaw, they were usually delivered within 2 or 3 days. So that changed significantly. To the place, to the archive. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comparison of the ages, but those who
Yes.
fought against the Nazis and were
Yeah.
communists and those who
Yeah.
were younger.
Yeah.
Any kind of psychological comparison in this document that you could make?
I mean, I do talk about 3 generations of women. So the oldest women were born the end of 19th century. So they are in their 50s and 60s, and these are usually the mothers of the men or women that were in the anti-communist post-war resistance. And for example, some of them worked as so-called aunties. They had a responsibility anytime there was, a new resistance cell being sort of implanted in Poland from London, let's say. They had a responsibility of taking care of them, finding apartments for them. This was sort of this war tradition. This was a practice that they actually developed during the war. So the oldest women were in their 60s and 70s. And the only way I can actually access these stories is through the cell spy reports. And it's also interesting that in the cell spy reports that I received, they are very often treated as, the grandmothers in a prison cell, with respect, always with respect. Then there is the generation born in the 1920s. That's, Barbara Sadowska, for example, or the majority of this is like the majority of, in the 10s and the 20s, the majority of the women I'm talking about, usually involved in the war resistance, in the Home Army, the National Armed Forces, and the majority of these women are trying, after the war, are trying to disentangle themselves from the resistance. Elżbieta Moczarska, the wife of Kazimierz Moczarski, right? She actually said in one of the letters to a friend in a sort of post-war situation that it takes years to build a house, right? So now it has to take years to dismantle this house. So that's why you cannot drop the post-resistance immediately in 1945-46. It has to continue for a number of years. But the majority of these women are actually very aware of the fact that this struggle does not make sense. And I think that's one of the differences between the Polish women and the Ukrainian insurgent army women. I've never seen in their stories, even though I don't have that many Ukrainian stories, but because they didn't want to talk to me. I was this strange thing, bird, hybrid thing that was coming to them, and they didn't know what to do with me. So they really were not that keen on talking to me. But in their stories, it's very rare that I'm aware of the fact that this doesn't make sense. It will take time for us to finish this engagement. And then there is the post-war, the dzieci wojny, right? The children that were born in the late 30s throughout the war, and they're in their teens. And I wish I spent more time on dealing with them. I was not. Only now I'm sort of realizing what it means to be in your early teens and get engaged into, some kind of. I think they were one of the most radical of all the people that I was interviewing. Also, I felt like there's pressure on time, so it was more important for me to talk to the women that were older, because I felt like this is the generation that is going away, than the young people.
Yeah, I apologize sincerely for the noise next door. Unfortunately, the rooms of the union are not as well insulated as they should be.
Walls are speaking.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is a good point for us to give another round of applause to Professor Anna Müller, and thank her for coming here.